Greco-Roman philosophers spent a lot of time discussing what it took to be virtuous, to be an excellent human, and that is ultimately the definition of virtue, isn't it? Is to be excellent. It's arete. And we then move to the question in your newest book: can it be taught? And Socrates had sort of two clear dialogues on this, didn't he? And frustratingly, almost, they lead to completely different conclusions. So, do you want to just probably first of all run us through, as I touched upon there, what virtue actually means? And then secondly, just set the scene for the next stage of the discussion we'll have in terms of can virtue be taught, by exploring Socrates' two dialogues.
Yeah, those are two crucial questions. So let's start with what virtue is. The word virtue comes from the Greek arete, which, as you mentioned a minute ago, means excellence. Now, so to be virtuous means to be an excellent at something. And that something doesn't have to be necessarily ethics. And in fact, excellence is not just something that human beings have. You can be an excellent in object. For instance, a few days ago, my wife and I went and bought a new bread knife because we needed a more reliable tool than we had at that time. Now, we bought an excellent bread knife, meaning a bread knife that is arete. It does what it's supposed to be doing very well, right? As opposed to a non-excellent bread knife, which would be a bread knife that is blunt and therefore doesn't actually cut the bread as it should. Now, the question then becomes, okay, and what counts as an excellent human being? In the case of a knife, we get it. Fine. If it cuts, then it's excellent. What about a human being? The Greco-Romans, and this is one of the most surprising things about their thought, and one of the things that really makes it still relevant today. Even though they knew nothing about science, they knew nothing about evolution, close to nothing about science, and definitely nothing about evolution or primatology or, anything like that. They came up with a fundamental idea that we still think today is pretty much true. Human beings, by nature, are shaped by nature to be social beings. Right? So an excellent human being is one that does two things. One, it reasons correctly, and two, acts in a pro-social fashion, a cooperative fashion with other human beings. Now, why would those two things be crucial? Because those are the two things that distinguish human beings from every other animal species. So when the Stoics ask themselves, what makes for a human being as opposed to a lion or a termite or anything else, their answer was pretty much on target. We are incredibly smart. We can think our way through problems. As we would put it today, our evolutionary weapon is our brain, because we don't have big muscles, we don't fly, we don't have fangs, we don't have nothing like what other animals do, but we do have large brains, and those large brains allow us to coordinate answers to existential problems and try to solve problems. So that's the first thing. We're very smart. We're capable of reason. Now, that doesn't mean that we use reason correctly all the time, but we are certainly capable of doing it. And the second thing that characterizes us is that we're highly social. There are other social animals, social insects, for instance, other social primates such as the bonobo chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys and things like that. But human societies are far more complex and far more intricate and far more interconnected than anything else that is in nature. So the Greco-Romans didn't know that this is the result of these two things, large brains and high sociality, are the results of natural selection for survival and reproduction. But they understood that they are natural characteristics of human beings. Just like a natural characteristic of a bread knife is to cut bread, is the ability to cut bread. And so an excellent or a virtuous human being is one who, A, uses reason correctly, and B, does so in order to improve social living.
And Socrates' conclusions on these were that one line of thinking was that we could be taught this, and the other line of thinking was that we couldn't be taught this. So, in terms of unpacking those, as you do in the book, which elements are what's important to set out so that we understand how he's come to those very, very disparate conclusions?
Yeah. The crucial dialogue there is a Platonic dialogue that was a dialogue written by Plato that's called the Protagoras, where Socrates has this interesting discussion with Protagoras. Protagoras was one of the sophists. And typically, Socrates and the sophists are kind of at odds with each other. They see things very differently. But in this particular case, they actually end up agreeing. They start out the dialogue from different positions. Socrates says, I don't think virtue can be taught. And Protagoras says, yes, it can. And then after a little bit of discussion, they end up agreeing. And they agree because Protagoras explains that virtue cannot be taught in the way in which we teach theoretical subject matters. So if you were to study, let's say, quantum mechanics, right, it would be mostly theory. I mean, there are experiments, of course, in quantum mechanics, but it's mostly about theory. You sit down, you open a book, you listen to somebody's lectures, and you learn quantum mechanics. That's what it means to learn quantum mechanics. So it's mostly or almost exclusively a theoretical enterprise. And Protagoras agrees with Socrates that that's not how virtue works. You can't just sit down and learn about virtue and then say, oh, I'm virtuous. What it is more similar to what the Greeks called a techne, a skill, a technique, right? So Protagoras makes the analogy there with playing the flute. And he says, look, what happens when you want to learn to play a musical instrument like the flute? Well, you do three things. You need three things. You need a little bit of theory. It's not entirely a theoretical thing, but you do need a little bit of theory. You need to know about musical notations and about the relationship between the notes. Otherwise, you're just going to get random stuff out of your flute, and that's not good. Doesn't sound good. You do need, ideally, a good teacher, meaning somebody who is not in the business of transferring a lot of theoretical information to you, just as in the case of a physics professor, let's say, but is somebody who looks at your technique and can make suggestions for improvements, right? Can point out, it's like, well, no, actually what you're doing here is not quite right. Try these other things. So it's a practical kind of teaching, right? And then the third thing you need, most importantly, is practice, 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 practice. So you do a lot of the simple scales, and then you get more complicated scales, and you start with simple tunes, you go to more complicated tunes, and you do that every day for hours every day until you get better. And in fact, it's a lifelong thing. You never stop really practicing the flute or any other musical instrument. If you look at virtue that way, as a technique, as a skill, then all of a sudden it turns out, yes, it can be taught. What you need is a little bit of theory. For instance, I gave you a few minutes ago the 4 cardinal virtues, and I explained what they are and how they work. That's theory. That's the theoretical part. Then, if you're lucky enough that you find yourself acquainted with a Socrates or a Seneca or an Epictetus, great. That's somebody who can teach you in the same way in which a music teacher or a language teacher, for that matter, will teach. Or a gym trainer, for instance. Same kind of general idea, right? The gym trainer doesn't do the exercises for you. It only looks at you doing the exercises and says, oh, actually, this is not the right form, and or you want to change it this way. And then what do? Most of the times you practice. Now, the question, however, is it's pretty clear, I think, to most of us how you practice a musical instrument or how you practice a language or how you practice exercises at the gym. But how the hell do you practice virtue, right? And here's a couple of examples. Musonius Rufus, who was a Stoic teacher, he was a Stoic philosopher, he was a Epictetus teacher, he lived in the 1st century of the modern era, said that, for instance, if you want to practice temperance is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, is the one that has to do with doing things in the right measure, neither too much nor too little. Well, you get yourself at least 3 occasions every day to practice temperance, every time you sit at the table to eat something. Because if you start paying mindful attention to what you eat and how you eat and how much and so on and so forth, then you're practicing temperance, which is really mindful attention to a particular activity that you're involved in. So that's one simple way to practice temperance. One way to practice, let's say, generosity, which is not one of the 4 cardinal virtues, but it is a virtue nevertheless, might be to, let's say, get into the habit of, before you leave the house, get some change, pocket change with you, and then go out and you give that change to the first homeless person you encounter. No questions asked. Now, initially, this will feel a little awkward. It will feel like, what am I doing here? But the more you do, every day the same thing, or most times of the week the same thing, then it becomes a habit. It becomes a sort of second nature. It's like, in fact, learning an instrument or learning to drive a car. Initially, you have to pay a lot of attention to everything you do consciously, but after a while, it becomes sort of second nature. So you do it without even thinking about it. So that's how you practice virtue.
It's interesting. The last examples there are great because you can't just get in a car and drive it unless you have a base level of understanding. So it's equipping somebody with the tools and the information, like all habits these days. So podcast culture, there's so many things that are in vogue at the moment because of this habit stacking, that we're all trying to be the best versions of ourselves on a day-to-day basis. But in reality, the four cardinal virtues are just, here's a bit of a framework for you to be a better version of yourself. One step forwards, practice, do the work, do the repetitions, you'll be better. Another step forwards, do the practice, do the repetitions, do the work, you'll be better. And then over time, you will actually create virtue within yourself rather than have to go elsewhere to find it, which again goes back to the reason that I take so much from Stoic philosophy, because it gives you the power.